So you may have noticed sometimes in an acid, all of the hydrogens act as acidic protons, such as in phosphoric acid H3PO4, all three of the protons are acidic. However, sometimes the hydrogens in an acid do not act as protons, such as acetic acid. Only one of the hydrogens acts as an acidic proton, while the other three are just normal hydrogens. So in this video, we're going to talk about why that is, like what makes a hydrogen in an atom or a molecule acidic or not, and then also introduce a third definition for acids and bases. So the two main factors that determine if a hydrogen bonded to something will be if the hydrogen will act as an acid or not are the bond strength and the bond polarity. In general, the more polar this bond is between the hydrogen and another atom, then the more easily it will break in water. Because as you can see here, in hydrochloric acid, the polar HCl bond easily dissociates, since the polar water molecules are attracted to different ends of the polar bond, as in the H plus from this bond will attract the negative oxygens of the water, while the chlorine ion, since it's partially negative, will attract the hydrogen parts of the water. So the water pulls the H and Cl apart. So that's why hydrochloric acid is a strong acid, because the high polarity of this bond makes it very easy to break in water. But then we notice something strange. All of the halogen acids, HCl, HBr, and HI, are strong acids except for hydrofluoric acid, which is opposite of what we would expect, since the hydrofluoric acid bond is the most polar bond. Remember that fluorine is the most electronegative atom. So even though the HF bond is very polar, we also have to take into account the bond strength. So it turns out that the HF bond in hydrofluoric acid is very strong, much stronger than any of the bonds in the other halogen acids. So despite its polarity, the bond strength makes it harder to break, and so HF turns out to be a weak acid. So if we have nonpolar bonds, such as in the CH bonds in acetic acid, then those are not likely to donate protons, because the nonpolar bond is less likely to break when dissolved in water. So this is why a lot of those weak bases have a bunch of hydrogens, but they don't act as acids, because they're usually bonded to a carbon. So another class of acids is the oxy acids, which contain a hydrogen bonded to an oxygen. So this bond is always pretty polar, so we have to look at the third atom in this three atom sequence. So we have a hydrogen bonded to an oxygen, which is bonded to a central atom. So an example of this is the HClO series. We have hypochlorous acid, chlorous acid, chloric acid, and then perchloric acid. Each time the number of oxygens increases by 1. And so as we have more oxygens on this side, the more electrons will be drawn over here. Since oxygen is very electronegative, it draws the electrons to itself. So the more the electrons are concentrated on this side, the more polar and weaker this OH bond on the other side becomes. And so as this bond becomes more polar and more weaker, then it's more likely to break in water, which is why perchloric acid and chloric acid, since they have so many oxygens over here, it makes this bond weaker and those will become strong acid. Whereas in chlorous acid and hypochlorous acid, there are not enough oxygens to draw away the electrons from this bond, and those are weak acids. So we have to look at which is stronger, the HO bond or the OX bond. For example, in sulfuric acid, the oxygen and sulfur bond is strong and covalent. So the more polar and weaker OH bond is more likely to break in water, which is why these hydrogens act as acidic protons in sulfuric acid. If we have the OX bond being ionic, remember that ionic bonds easily dissociate in water because of the polar water molecule. An example of this is NaOH. The Na bonded to the O is an ionic bond. Then that bond will be more likely to dissociate in water than the OH bond, which is why when NaOH dissolves in water, we get this Na and O bond breaks, and we get the hydroxide ion and the sodium ion. So when we dissolve covalent oxides in water, they will form acids. For example, SO2 reacts with water to form H2SO3. We know that it's not sulfuric acid, H2SO4, because this is easier to balance the equation. And then we have carbon dioxide in water forms carbonic acid, whereas ionic oxides will dissolve in water to produce bases. For example, calcium oxide and water produces calcium hydroxide, and potassium oxide and water produces potassium hydroxide. So now we're going to talk about the Lewis model for acids and bases, which is the third definition. Remember, we have the Arrhenius and the Bronsted-Lowry. For most of the unit, we've been using the Bronsted-Lowry definition. So according to the Lewis model, acids are electron pair acceptors, which means they have an empty orbital, and bases are electron pair donors. They have a lone pair which they can share with the acid's empty orbital. So from the Bronsted-Lowry definition, we know that ammonia, NH3, acts as a base. It accepts a proton. So here is that reaction in the Lewis model. So we have the H+, it has no electrons, so it has an empty orbital, which classifies it as an acid. And then on the ammonia, we have a lone pair on the nitrogen. So it will act as a base. So the ammonia will basically donate its electron pair to the acid H+. So they use the empty orbital on the H+ acid to share the nitrogen's lone pair, forming another NH bond in ammonium. So the point of the Lewis model is that it is more broad than the Bronsted-Lowry definition. So for example, we have BF3 and ammonia. So this would not be classified as an acid-base reaction in the Bronsted-Lowry model. But in the Lewis model, you can see the boron is electron deficient. It only has 6 electrons around it. So it has an empty orbital, and it can accept an electron pair from the lone pair on the nitrogen in ammonia. So this acts as a Lewis acid, and this acts as a Lewis base. So again, the Lewis base uses its lone pair to forge a covalent bond with the electron deficient atom in the Lewis acid. So since the boron in BF3 is electron deficient, it can be classified as a strong Lewis acid, since it's very eager to accept extra electron pairs. Another example of a Lewis acid base reaction is the hydration of a metal ion. So here we have the acid is Al3+. It has a lot of empty orbitals since it has no valence electrons. And then the base is water. So we have 6 water molecules in this reaction, and each of those 6 water molecules will donate one of their lone pairs to the aluminum ion. So the aluminum ion will accept 6 electron pairs from all of the waters.